For the longest time, he believed with complete conviction that the problem was everything around him. The people in his life who didn't understand what he was trying to build or where he was trying to go, the opportunities that never seemed to arrive for him the way they appeared to arrive for everyone else, the circumstances that seemed specifically arranged to work against him, regardless of how much effort he applied to changing them. And every time something failed, every time a plan collapsed, or a door closed, or a result came back wrong, there was always something available to point toward that wasn't himself. It made sense for a long time. It made sense in the way that any explanation makes sense when it protects you from having to look somewhere more uncomfortable for the answer you actually need. It was coherent and it was consistent, and it allowed him to keep moving forward with his understanding of himself intact, with the belief that his potential was real and his dreams were valid, and the only thing standing between where he was and where he wanted to be was a set of external conditions that simply hadn't aligned in his favor yet. Until one day it stopped making sense. Not because a single dramatic event forced the issue into the open, not because someone confronted him with evidence he couldn't dispute or argued him into a corner he couldn't explain his way out of, but because the pattern had become impossible to continue ignoring with any honest part of himself still functioning. Different situations producing the same frustration, different faces surrounding the same results, different circumstances leading back to the same place every time, regardless of what he changed on the outside. And then a thought crossed his mind one ordinary day without any particular invitation, arriving quietly and settling in with the patient weight of something that had been waiting for exactly the right moment to finally be heard. What if the problem wasn't out there? What if the thing that had been standing between him and every version of the life he wanted to build was not the circumstances or the people or the timing or the luck? What if it was him, not his potential and not his dreams and not the ambition that had always been genuinely present underneath everything else? But the part of him he had never learned to control, the part that had been running unchecked for years while he pointed his attention everywhere else. Nothing about his life changed overnight in any of the visible ways that people around him would have been able to point to and identify as evidence that something fundamental had shifted. There was no announcement made to the people in his life about what he had decided, no dramatic and public transformation that gave the change a timestamp and an audience, no moment that announced itself as the beginning of something new. Just a quiet and private decision made without ceremony in the ordinary hours of an ordinary day to stop lying to himself about what was actually driving the outcomes he had been producing for years. And that was when the real war began, not with the people who had let him down or the circumstances that had worked against him or the external forces he had spent so long cataloging as the source of his problems, but with the version of himself that had always chosen comfort over the harder and more honest alternative, the part of him that reached for distraction the moment discipline became uncomfortable, the part that reacted to things before thinking them through, that followed every impulse before examining whether following it was actually in his interest, the part that had always known the easier way out of any situation and had always eventually found a justification for taking it. Every day that version of him showed up without fail. It showed up in the mornings when the easier choice was obvious and available, and the harder one required something he wasn't sure he had enough of yet. It showed up in the moments of frustration and pressure and fatigue when the old patterns felt like relief rather than retreat. And every day he had to face it directly without the buffer of blame or distraction or the comfortable story that the real obstacle was somewhere outside of him. There were no witnesses to any of this. Nobody saw the moments when he wanted to quit and talked himself past it without anyone there to acknowledge the effort that cost him. Nobody saw the times he forced his attention back to what needed to be done when everything in him was pulling toward escape and comfort and the familiar relief of simply stopping. It was exhausting in a way that had no outward expression, repetitive in a way that offered no external validation, silent in a way that meant every victory he accumulated existed only inside him where no one else could see or acknowledge or confirm it. But something was changing in that silence. Something was being built in those unseen and unwitnessed moments that couldn't be rushed and couldn't be faked and couldn't be shortcut into existence through any means other than the slow and unglamorous accumulation of one small decision after another. Because every small decision made in the right direction was a victory that belonged entirely and permanently to him. At some point along the way, without being able to identify exactly when the crossing had happened or what specific moment had been the one that tipped the balance, he realized that he had stopped reacting to things the way he always had before. The triggers that had previously produced immediate and predictable responses no longer seemed to connect to the same automatic reactions they had always delivered. The emotional weather that had once determined the direction of his behavior, regardless of what he actually wanted to do, had lost its authority over him in a way he hadn't anticipated and couldn't have fully planned for. He paused now where he used to launch forward without thinking. He observed what was happening inside him before deciding what to do about it, and then he chose deliberately and from a place of actual intention rather than unexamined impulse. He stopped asking himself what he felt like doing in any given moment and started asking instead what the moment actually required of him, what the right action was independent of whether it happened to align with whatever he was feeling at the time. And then he did it, not because it was comfortable and not because it was easy and not because the feeling he was working against had disappeared or gone quiet, but because he had decided that his actions were no longer going to be determined by the loudest emotion in the room. That was the shift that changed everything downstream from it. Not loud in its arrival and not dramatic in the way it presented itself to the people around him, but permanent in a way that distinguished it from every previous attempt he had made to change how he operated in the world. Because for the first time in his life, the connection between his intentions and his actions was no longer being intercepted and redirected by the emotional patterns that had always operated faster than his conscious decision-making. His behavior was no longer controlled by the first thing he felt. It was controlled by him. The people around him started registering that something was different before any of them had found the language to describe what exactly they were noticing or why it was affecting the way they experienced him. They couldn't locate the specific change with any precision, couldn't point to a single thing that had been added or removed that would account for the shift in how he occupied a room or moved through a conversation or handled the moments that used to produce predictable reactions from him. He was quieter than he had been before, but the quiet didn't read as weakness or withdrawal. It read as something more self-contained, more deliberate, more rooted in a stillness that he had earned rather than performed. Calmer in a way that was clearly not passivity or indifference, but rather the calm of someone who had developed a genuine relationship with their own internal state and no longer needed the external environment to be a certain way in order to remain steady within it. Situations that had previously been capable of destabilizing him, conversations designed to provoke a reaction, pressures applied from the outside to test where his edges were, no longer moved him in the ways they once reliably had. He didn't argue with the same energy he used to bring to arguments, didn't chase the same validations he had once needed, didn't respond to the familiar provocations with the familiar responses that people had learned to expect from him and had, in some cases, learned to rely on. It confused the people who had known the previous version of him, the version that could be influenced and triggered and pulled off center by the right combination of pressure and circumstance. because that version was gone and what had replaced it was something they didn't have a ready framework for understanding or predicting. He had become steady in a way that wasn't rigid and grounded in a way that didn't come across as closed, unpredictable now in an entirely different direction, not because you couldn't read him, but because what you found when you looked was no longer something that could be easily leveraged. Because when a person removes emotional reactivity from the set of tools that other people can use to influence them, when the buttons that use to produce reliable responses have been systematically disconnected from the reactions they once triggered, something fundamental changes in the dynamic between that person and everyone around them. They become someone who cannot be easily moved by external pressure, someone who cannot be easily redirected by other people's agendas or other people's emotional weather, or the familiar social mechanics that work reliably on people who haven't done the interior work he had spent the last months doing in complete and unrewarded silence. He didn't become dangerous overnight, and he didn't become dangerous through the accumulation of external power or status or any of the visible markers that the world typically uses to determine whether someone is worth taking seriously. He became dangerous through something quieter and more fundamental and more difficult to replicate than any of those things. He became dangerous because he was no longer divided within himself in the way he had been for most of his life, pulled simultaneously in different directions by competing impulses and unexamined patterns and the constant low-level friction of a person who wants one thing but consistently does another. The internal war that had consumed so much of his energy for so long had been resolved not through suppression or denial, but through the slow and patient work of actually learning to govern himself from the inside. His thoughts and his actions and his focus had stopped pulling against each other and had begun moving in the same direction with a consistency and a coherence that freed up a quality of energy and attention he hadn't previously had access to. And that kind of alignment, that specific convergence of intention and behavior sustained over time without constant internal negotiation, is genuinely rare in a way that most people don't fully appreciate until they're standing in front of someone who has actually achieved it. No distraction could take ownership of his attention for long enough to redirect him from what he had decided mattered. No emotional provocation could override the deliberate and examined responses he had developed in place of the reactive ones that used to operate automatically. No external pressure could break what had been built through months of unglamorous and unwitnessed interior work, because the foundation it had been built on was not performance or willpower or any resource that depletes under sustained pressure. It was self-knowledge and structure and the particular kind of unshakable calm that comes from having made peace with the hardest and most honest version of who you actually are. And that was when the truth that had been building through everything finally became completely clear. The real power he had been searching for in every external direction, in better circumstances and more understanding people and opportunities arranged more favorably, had been available to him the entire time. It had never been in controlling the world around him or in waiting for the conditions outside him to become more cooperative or more fair or more aligned with what he needed them to be. It had always been in controlling himself, in mastering the interior before expecting the exterior to respond differently. In becoming, through patient and private and entirely unglamorous work, the kind of person whose relationship with themselves is so clear and so settled that nothing from the outside world can reach in and disturb what has been built there. Because the moment he mastered that, the moment the inside of him finally matched the direction he had always claimed to be moving in, something changed in the way he occupied his own life that no external circumstance could touch or take away. He didn't need the world to cooperate in order to function at the level he was capable of functioning at. He didn't need perfect conditions or the right people or the absence of obstacles in order to keep moving in the direction he had chosen. He had become, through the only kind of work that produces that result, genuinely and quietly and permanently unstoppable, not because nothing could challenge him, but because nothing from the outside could reach the part of him that decided how he responded to being challenged. And that, in the end, is the only kind of dangerous that actually lasts.